United States, Miscanthus is still quite expensive to plant. It's a little bit more available in Europe than it is here. Part of that reason is because it's sterile and we've had to propagate the same material from clones, and that's just taken time. But it is commercially available today. There's a variety of Miscanthus providers that will do everything from provide you rhizomes or plugs to actually help you plant the crop and find places to market it. The majority of the costs associated with Miscanthus are up front. So if you think about this in comparison to a corn crop, for instance. Okay, so the first year of Miscanthus, what do you have? You have the costs of field preparation. Of course, you have your land rent and all of your capital expenses. Those are going to be roughly the same between the cornfield and the Miscanthus field. You have the price of the rhizomes. That can be anywhere from $500 to $1,000 an acre based on where we are today in the U.S. You have the price of herbicide in the first year. It is important to apply herbicides, but that becomes less important in subsequent years. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then there's the price of harvesting. Critically with Miscanthus, you don't want to harvest in the first year. At least in the upper Midwest, we found that harvesting in the first year kind of sets the plant back in the next year. Okay, so the first year, as I described it, is kind of a loss, right? You know, you're spending all this money up front to plant the crop and you can't even harvest it in the first year. Now you have years 2 through, let's just say 20. Years 2 through 20. Okay, year 2, you might apply a little bit of herbicide depending on how good your land is and how well the crop is competing with weeds. Then you harvest it. Years 3 through 20, you harvest it. We might apply a little bit of maintenance fertilizer, probably some nitrogen, probably some potassium. I don't know what to tell you for how often to do that. It might be every 2 years, it might be every 4 years, it might be every 8 years. We're still working on that, and it will depend on the inherent productivity of the soil that you're on. But the nutrient requirements are quite a bit lower than an annual grain crop because this crop is cycling those nutrients internally. Okay, so how does that compare to corn? Well, corn crop, you have annual inputs of seed, pesticides, fertilizer, and you have those every year in addition to harvest costs. So yeah, you get a grain receipt every year, you know, income from selling that grain, but you also have substantial input costs. I think where Miscanthus becomes interesting is in those areas of land that may be more sensitive, that you'd rather not put intensive row crops on that have a lot of chemical inputs. And maybe, again, like you just don't want to mess with it. Maybe it's just hard to drive to those areas, or you'd rather not spend so much time on them. Put Miscanthus there, and then you just really just harvest it every year and get a check. So that part's kind of nice. It's a long-term outlet crop from a market perspective as well as from an environmental perspective. There's a lot of reasons in the U.S. to grow biomass crops, to grow perennial biomass crops, and probably the one that's least developed is the economic reasons. So right now we don't have good developed markets for selling biomass in the United States, and there's a lot of reasons for that, none of which have to do with its agronomy. So the agronomy of Miscanthus, the science behind using this and growing this, is really pretty straightforward. So what do? You plant the crop, right? We've already talked about that. You plant a rhizome or a plug. You plant it every 30 inches, and then you spray some chemicals to help control weeds in the first year. But after that, you really won't spray chemicals again. And to illustrate that fact, I'd like to point out the weeds here alongside of our research plots, that they're plentiful. You see foxtail, you see mare's tail, you see, let's see, what else do I see? I see brome grass, which is actually a decent weed for us, a lot of lamb's quarter. So a variety of weeds, pigweeds of course. But then now I'd like to invite you to look inside the stand, and as you go further into the stand, you see fewer and fewer weeds. Why does this happen? It happens because Miscanthus comes up very early in the spring. I mentioned it was quite cold tolerant, so really about the time that the soil is warm enough for you to think about planting corn, Miscanthus is already coming out of the ground. And it's doing it with all the power of the fully established rhizome system behind it. So that means it's already got developed roots, it's got enough fertilizer, it's got enough sugars. It can really put a lot of energy into expanding its canopy, expanding leaf area. And as it does that, it just shades out weeds. So it's typically intercepting most of the light that hits the ground by the middle of May in our area. So if you think about using plants as a solar collector, which is what we're trying to do with bioenergy, it's collecting that solar energy and doing it so efficiently that weeds actually can't compete with the crop. So that means we don't have to put on as much pesticide. Miscanthus is actually proven to be so far fairly resistant to other types of pests, including insects and diseases. Given time, that will probably change. Insects and diseases will adapt to live on Miscanthus, and we've already seen that. But what we haven't seen is that they're doing economic damage to this crop. And that might be because this isn't a very tasty crop. We're not growing grain, we're not growing sugar. There's not as many tasty things to eat in a Miscanthus crop as there might be in a food crop. So we don't have to put on as much pesticides. Now let me talk about some other environmental services. For instance, water regulation. Everything that you see above ground here in terms of biomass production is actually matched below ground. Miscanthus giganteus has about a 1-to-1 root to shoot ratio. So there's a lot happening below us. And all those roots and all those rhizomes serve to intercept water as it moves. So we're in Iowa. We seem to have periodic flooding and drought like most of the Midwest seems to have these days. And Miscanthus actually helps to buffer that. So in the area that we're standing right now, there's a river that's just maybe 100 yards behind me. And 2 years ago, that river flooded, and this whole area that we're standing was underwater in August. Temperature is about 95 degrees. The area was underwater for at least 3 days. All the corn crops around it died. We had tree trunks coming into the field. We had a lot of trash, a lot of other things. It all stopped Miscanthus. And the Miscanthus didn't die, in fact it flourished. So we had hot, wet temperatures and it didn't die, it flourished. So not only did the Miscanthus protect the surrounding crops by slowing that water, slowing the movement of all the sediment that came from the river, but it also didn't hurt the crop and probably below ground stopped a lot of chemical transport. So the crop actively uses nitrate, it actively takes up some pesticides. So think about atrazine. Those are things that can be taken up as the crop uses water. So it can help regulate and purify water flow, which seems to be becoming increasingly important in the Midwest. What about its impact on soil? We looked inside earlier to see how Miscanthus shades out weeds, but one thing that's also good to notice is the amount of leaf litter that you see on the soil surface. All these leaves that you see on the crop right behind me will start to drop off the longer this crop stands in the field. So from a marketing perspective, that's bad, right? You're losing yield. You can lose anywhere from 30 to 50% of the biomass yield of this crop by leaving it to stand in the field over winter. But from a crop quality perspective, it might be good because these leaves sometimes have different characteristics than the stems. So opposite of forage, really, right? In forage, you want the leaves and not the stems. For biomass, you want the stems and not the leaves. And all these leaves get trapped. So they fall down, and then you have this, all these stems in here that kind of trap those leaves. And so what you have is this organic matter layer that builds up really quickly. In part because the stuff doesn't rot that fast. I mentioned it was used for roofing material. It kind of stays on the soil surface. It really protects that soil. So you have rhizomes and roots building the soil from below, and then you have leaves and litter from the crop falling from above. And that makes a nice organic matter layer quite rapidly. So from a perspective of improving soil organic matter and all the benefits that we associate with increased soil organic matter, Miscanthus really has a lot to offer.